At the end of our last class, I began to reflect with you on certain refrains characteristic of the book of Kings. You will hear me refer usually to the book of Kings, by the way. It is originally one work. It was divided into two when it was translated from Hebrew into Greek, because the Greek took up a lot more room because it has vowels. So eventually, the Hebrew text itself copied the Greek in dividing into two books, but it's originally one book, the Book of Kings. Today I want to pick up where we left off. Oh, I'm really getting the competition here. I know if I were sitting out there, I wouldn't be listening to me at all. I'd be watching her. Cute will always trump. Cute always trumps everything else. First, by the time that the Book of Kings, pardon me, was put into its final form, that's F-O-R-M, by the way. Generations of students have pointed out to me that F-O-R-M, spoken by a Kentuckian, sounds like F-A-R-M. By the time the Book of Kings was put into its final shape, the monarchy was long gone. It had disappeared. After the Babylonian captivity, no son of David ever again sat on the throne of Israel or even of Judah. After the Babylonian captivity, when some of the Israelites, only a minority, came back, the vast majority of the Jews lived outside the Holy Land and have since the Babylonian captivity. There are certainly more Jews living in Israel now than have ever lived there in the entire history of the world. But after the Babylonian captivity, the legitimate heir to the Davidic throne, a man by the name of Zerubbabel, came back to Jerusalem, but he came back as the appointed Persian governor, not as king. And after the construction of the Second Temple, we hear no more about him. We presume that Zerubbabel returned to Babylon to live out the rest of his life. Now, as the editor of this book looked back on the history of Israel's monarchy, he did not see much reason why the monarchy should be restored. Heaven knows that contemporary Israel has no intention of restoring a monarchy, nor of restoring a temple. There may be a handful of Jews who still think it would be nice to have the sacrifice of bulls and goats, but I don't think most Jews are the least bit interested in that. After the division of the kingdoms in 922, things had almost never gone well, and never in the north. The southern kingdom, Judah, had only a scattered handful. The southern kingdom, Judah, had only a scattered handful of decent kings. And the northern kingdom, Israel, did not produce a single one. This final author of the Book of Kings I would think I would just confuse you by calling him a Deuteronomic editor, but that's what I'm sure he was, but I would have to, if I insist on that, I'll have to explain a lot more history than I want to. He used two particular formulas to describe the kings of the chosen people. First, he assessed each of the kings of Judah by whether or not they followed the example of David. Okay. Now, I've always been astounded by this, that the best the book of Kings can say about any king is that he measured up to David's standard. I thought, David's standards? Murder, adultery, just shows how tolerant God is. But most of the kings of Judah didn't rise that high. I put down, I think, on your text a couple of passages. 1 Kings 15:11 about Asa. Asa did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, like his father David. Now, we spoke about Asa last week, didn't we? Time for a quiz. Okay. What was the name of Asa's grandmother? Very good. Maacah. Very good. Okay. I wasn't sure anybody would know. We only spent an hour on her last week. 2 Kings 18:1. It's another good king. Now it came to pass in the 3rd year of Hoshea, the son of Elah, king of Israel, that Hezekiah, the son of Ahaz, king of Judah, began to reign. And he did what was right in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father David had done. Second, pardon me, the kings of Israel are all condemned, all of them, every one of them, because they followed the example of Jeroboam the first. That is to say, they were idolaters. Remember, Jeroboam the first put golden calves, but Dan and down at Bethel. They were idolaters. The northern kingdom was idolatrous from the very beginning. At the same time, God kept sending them prophets. 9th century Elijah. 8th century Hosea and Amos. 1 Kings 15:33. In the 3rd year of Asa, king of Judah, Baasha, the son of Ahijah, became king over all Israel in Tirzah for 24 years. If you look over there on the back, you have your map. See where the city of Tirzah is. It's just somewhat east of Samaria. Tirzah was very often the capital of the northern kingdom, Tirzah. I will have a lot more to say about Tirzah when we get to the 8th century, because of some very serious excavations were made in Tirzah. Oh my goodness, it's hard to believe it's been almost a century now, 80 years. And I want to say some things about those excavations at Tirzah. Verse 34. He did evil in the sight of the Lord, and walked in the way of Jeroboam, and in his sin by which he made Israel to sin. 1 Kings 15:25. He was the founder of another dynasty in the north, Omri. Omri did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and did worse than all who were before him, for he walked in all the ways of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, and in his sin by which he made Israel to sin, provoking the Lord, God of Israel, to anger with their idols. So each in his own way, both David and Jeroboam are exemplars. Any questions so far? All right. Second, unlike the chronicler, the author of Kings is interested in both kingdoms. Never during the 2 centuries shared by both kingdoms is either realm allowed to disappear from the reader's attention. I believe there's a serious lesson to be learned in there. That God, in spite of that split, that God did not abandon either side. Can anybody think of how that might apply in practical ecclesiology?
Divorce?
No, I'm thinking, exactly. The church split right down the middle in 1054. God, in my opinion, God has never abandoned either side. I find saints on both sides. I see the influence of God on both sides. That's why, as an Orthodox Christian, I'm not ready to write off the West. I'm not ready to do that. Now, that may pose some other questions, but I'm really quite convinced that God has not abandoned any of those sides. And the people who are heirs of the catastrophe of 1054, who are heirs of the catastrophe of 1517, I don't believe God has abandoned them at all. Just because bad decisions were made by proud bishops in the Mediterranean or by lunatic monks in Germany, I don't think God has abandoned all these people. But that's something to the side. The year of each king's ascent is determined by his relationship to his counterpart in the other kingdom. And this set format of synchronization keeps us abreast of both kingdoms at all times. Both kingdoms, in spite of their political and even theological separation, still pertain to the people of God. God still calls Israel his people. By the prophet, he calls them his people, and they're worshiping golden calves. Both kingdoms were responsible, too, for the great loss of what had seemed during Solomon's time so promising. And Israel and Judah were finally joined in a common tragedy. And the northern kingdom did not survive that tragedy. They're gone. At the rate I'm going now, we should reach the Babylonian captivity when I'm about 98. But maybe we'll hurry it up in there somewhere. Third, the narrative in Kings follows certain determined patterns. We are invariably given the year of each king's ascent, the length of his reign, a qualitative assessment of it, significant events associated with each king, and a reference to each king's death, burial, and successor. We don't have anything in antiquity comparable to that. We don't have anything like that amount of material on the pharaohs or the Assyrian emperors and so forth. In addition, the mothers of the kings of Judah are usually named, perhaps simply because they were preserved in the archival material available to the author. The book's recourse to set formulas should preserve us from a too literal interpretation of certain passages. For instance, take the case of a king named Zimri. Let me just have a show of hands. How many of you here have ever heard the name Zimri before? Yeah, somebody who's actually read the Bible. But you see, it's also possible to read the Bible and maybe not notice that name. You know? I've noticed this since I've been here at All Saints. Not a single couple has ever presented me with a little boy to be named Zimri. I've noticed that. I can check with Father Andrew. Maybe they've sneaked one in on me since. There's a good reason for people not remembering Zimri. He wasn't king very long. Chapter 16, verse 15. In the 27th year of Asa, king of Judah, that's the year, by the way, is 876. 876. Zimri reigned in Tirzah 7 days. If you blinked, it was gone. The army was encamped near Gibbethon, a Philistine town. When Zimri saw that the city was taken, he went into the citadel of the royal palace and set the palace on fire around him, so he died. Because of the sins he had committed, doing evil in the sight of the Lord, and following the ways of Jeroboam, and committing the same sin Jeroboam had caused Israel to commit. Now, it's hard to think that Zimri, whose reign lasted 1 week, really did manage in so short a time to accomplish all the accumulated evil done by Jeroboam over a span of 22 years. Zimri would be much worse than Jeroboam. There's an example where you sort of have to give a little bit of literary license to the author. Fourth, there is a pronounced attention given to prophecy. By the way, Nancy, the title of this is Kings and Prophets. You got it down. Okay. Kings and Prophets. There's pronounced attention given to prophecy, particularly with respect to the northern kingdom. Indeed, it is especially in connection with biblical economics that we were discussing the prophets of the 9th and 8th centuries. It's just impossible to consider biblical economics without giving a lot of attention to the prophets, because the prophets had a great deal to say about money, the unjust uses of money, the unjust unequal distribution of money and resources, the oppression of the poor, the establishment of political and social institutions for the preservation of poverty. The Bible has a lot to say about that through the mouths of the prophets. It is likely, in fact, that the stories of the prophets in the books of Kings are better known than the stories of the kings themselves. I suspect that the average Bible reader can say a great deal more about Elijah than he can say about Solomon. I know that our children could have told you about Elijah, could have told you a lot of stuff about Elijah, at least by age 2. I have no doubt on that point. Because I told them stories about Elijah, and I made them learn a song about Elijah, and they sang it by heart. It went, "Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to take me home." I'll bet in our Sunday school right now, there are children who can tell you a lot about Elijah. I suspect that some of them might not really know about Zimri. I mean, it's the outside chance. As we shall see in due course, the relationship between the kings and the prophets in the Bible has a lot to do with the economy, especially the distribution of wealth. Indeed, the Bible's first literary prophet, Amos, was preoccupied with economic oppression in Israelite society. He devotes his entire prophecy to that. Now let's put the whole question about kings and prophets into a larger historical and literary perspective. Namely, how does a student of history divide his subject into intelligible units, any history? How do we do that? Well, yeah, of course, chronologically. It's a question of how divided chronologically. when I took 2 seminars in American church history. In my doctoral program at Southern Baptist, I took 2 seminars in American church history. A seminar that went from the beginning to 1860, from 1860 until the present day. What's the wisdom of that division?
Civil War.
Civil War. The Civil War, obviously. And I had a very, very fine professor, Dr. Penrose Santamont. What a great guy. Penrose Santamont from New Orleans. He ran that seminar. And you know, he let me write my paper on, this is American church history, but he let me write my paper on the Promethean theology of Melville. I thought I was going to have to, you know, take some parish and go through the parish records, you know, records of, that's what historians do. You know, those of you who keep minutes at the parish council meeting, you know, that's going to be recorded. You know, there'll be someday somebody's going to read those things and find out who voted for what. Okay. For the second one, from 1860 until whenever it was, I was a student. I was a student in the early 1970s. I was a student there. He let me write on Jesse Hill Ford, who at the time was still a living author. Jesse Hill Ford was still, and he had not written everything he was eventually to write, but he let me write on that. A common way of dividing Old Testament history is based on the era of the monarchy. For example, the Gospel of Matthew. A little over a month from now, we'll be getting that. It'll be read in church just before Christmas, won't we? Just before Christmas. Matthew traces the genealogy of Jesus according to 3 distinct periods. Pre-monarchical, verses 2 to 6, monarchical, verses 7 to 11, and post-monarchical, verses 12 to 16. It's very clear. Matthew does that. Thus wrote Matthew, so all the generations of Abraham to David are 14 generations. From David until the captivity of Babylon are 14 generations. From the captivity in Babylon until the Christ are 14 generations. So Matthew divides it into 3 according to the monarchy. Now, needless to say, the division of history by political periods is a common pattern of historiography. Historians of Rome, for example, have always parceled the material by reference to the Republic and the Empire. And the emperors themselves serve as signposts to identify various periods of the empire, particularly dynastic emperors. When we come to biblical history, however, this kind of division presents a methodological difficulty, for the simple reason that Israel's political history is less significant than other theological concerns. Now, somebody like Christie has had lots of history, well, but I bet when you, all those courses you took, I bet there was very little reference made to who was king or who was president or anything. It was a question of who were the artists. You know, what was the style? Well, art tends to escape from this. Art history. Literary history tends to escape from this. Well, I've read only 100 volumes of the works of George Simenon, which is about, I think, a little less than half of what he wrote. So I've read only 100 volumes of him. You would not know, in George Simenon, you would have no idea that he's writing during a certain period of history, because his stories, which are all detective stories, they're all separated from political history. You would not know that. That's not true of all novelists. It's very clear, for example, when take The Sun Also Rises, Hemingway. Hemingway roots his in history for sure. He tells you, he even tells you who the heavyweight champion of the world is at the time. He entirely related to an historical period. In fact, he's writing about the lost generation, as it's been called. Not everybody is that interested in political history, nor should they be. Now, with respect to the Bible, the political division of biblical history is problematic, largely because the Bible is more concerned about God's activity than about man's activity. Traditionally, the church does not read the Bible's so-called historical books as political history. That's why we don't insist, for example, that our children memorize the dates of the kings of Israel and Judah. We do insist, or we should, in my time they certainly did, you have to memorize the dates of all the presidents of the United States. That was de rigueur when I was going through. You had to know every single president exactly when he was president. For instance, St. Augustine, that great father of the church, whose works are recommended by 2 ecumenical councils without reservation, St. Augustine of Hippo believed that Israel's monarchical period was really more about the prophets than about the kings. And I have a text there from St. Augustine's The City of God, Book 17. I'll just sort of read that with you. The book of the City of God, by the way, was a work that Augustine composed after the fall and sacking of Rome in the year 410. Now, from the time when Holy Samuel began to prophesy, and ever onward until the people of Israel was led into Babylonia, and until, according to the prophecy of Holy Jeremiah, of Israel's return thence after 70 years, the house of God was built anew. This whole era, this whole epoch, hoc itaque tempus, is the era of the prophets. Totem tempus est prophetarum, time of the prophets. He's not that concerned about kings, he's concerned about prophets. For although both the patriarch Noah himself and others before and after him may not improperly be styled prophets, yet those are most and chiefly called the days of the prophets, from the time when Samuel began to prophesy, who at God's command first anointed Saul to be king, and on his rejection, David himself. I think Augustine, is speaking for the whole church there. Yes, Chris?
Oh, no, I'm just saying my earword.
Well, in that case, I should be talking a little louder. Appreciate it. And I have to admit that is a thing with me. My voice is not what it used to be. There was a time, and it wasn't all that long ago, when I would speak in a whisper and frighten the horses. Okay. Now, because the Bible is one of our major sources of information about the ancient world of the Middle East, it is understandable that we tend still to divide the material by way of reference to Israel's political systems. We move from the period of the judges to the establishment of the monarchy in Samuel, and then on to the history of the monarchy in Kings. And then after Kings, Ezra and Nehemiah. In the Hebrew Bible itself, however, all of the books from Joshua to Malachi are called the prophetic books. Well, got that there? I don't think most Christians think of that, but the Hebrew Bible does. All of the books, starting with Joshua and going to Malachi, are all what they call the Nevi'im, the prophetic books. That is to say, even the books of Kings are included in the Bible's prophetic books. The Nevi'im, the prophets, was assembled as a distinct body of literature, perhaps during the 3rd century before Christ. This section of the Bible itself is readily divided into 2 parts. What are called the prior prophets, which is the long historical narrative of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. That's called the prior prophets. Not because they happened earlier, but because they fall that way in the Bible. And the second, the literary works of the prophets themselves. All that literature dates from the 8th century on. So the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings are part of the Hebrew Bible known as the former prophets, or the prior prophets. This designation indicates that these historical books are read first, because they provide the necessary context for the reading of the next section of the canon, namely the latter prophets. The latter prophets include, of course, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12, also known as the minor prophets. Minor only because their books are shorter. Thus, what we think of as the Bible's prophetic books are rendered inseparable from the context of their historical books. I want to insist on that because otherwise the biblical prophecy just sort of fades out into religious theory. The biblical prophets are not allowed to become mere religious philosophers. It is important to keep in mind as we read this material the sustained relationships between them. Yes, Chris?
I'm sorry, Father, would you repeat your point about the religious prophets are never allowed to be what?
They're never allowed to drift off into religious philosophy. Okay. They're always rooted. The real hard part of the Nicene Creed is the expression under Pontius Pilate. If it weren't for under Pontius Pilate, the whole thing could be mythology. There are plenty of dead and rising gods throughout history. But when you put under Pontius Pilate, we mean it really happened. And that's why there have been religious philosophers that I can accept all the creed except that part about Pontius Pilate. Because Pontius Pilate, that reference to Pontius Pilate, roots it in political history. It says that the life of Christ is not a myth. It can't be floated off into mythology. It really happened. In the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar, at John the Baptist, in the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar, quoting the Gospel of Luke. Everybody follow on that? I'm glad you asked that question, Chris, because I probably needed to say it again. It's important to keep in mind as we read this material the sustained relationship between, say, Kings and the prophetic writings. The writings of the prophets are inseparable from the historical structure within the Nevi'im. Let us start, for instance, with the first of the minor prophets. I think they have this text down on your page, I think. Hosea, the beginning of the book of Hosea. Why am I taking Hosea? Because it falls first in the order. I'm not positive that Hosea is the earliest, but his prophecy is given there first among the minor prophets. Here we go. The word of the Lord that came to Hosea, the son of Beeri, in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel. I put every one of those kings down at the very bottom of your page in their dates. Everybody follow me on that? I took each of those kings and put them down there at the bottom of the page so you can see what he's talking about. It was during that period that Hosea speaks. The editor of the prophecy of Hosea specifically sends the reader to the book of Kings. We observe that Hosea, who was a northern prophet, by the way, he's the only one of the literary prophets who actually hailed from the north, is first placed within the historical context of the southern kings. Only then does the editor mention the northern king at the time, Jeroboam II. Everybody follow what I'm getting at? You follow that on your paper? I hope I'm not getting too subtle. Subtlety, you'll become somebody from Kentucky. The writing down and preservation of the prophetic words was arguably the most distinctive contribution of 8th century Israel. The very act of transcribing God's oracles manifested a different perspective, a new awareness that the prophetic message was possessed of a permanent relevance beyond the circumstances of the original time and place. The prophecies of Nathan in the 10th century and of Elijah in the 9th century were spoken into the air, and they disappeared like any other spoken word. The narratives of the books of Samuel and Kings preserve only scraps of what those prophets said. They weren't writers. Someone in the 8th century, however, perhaps Hosea himself, believed that his prophetic message had about it a timeless significance. In the course of criticizing the economic, political, social, and religious situation of his age, Hosea was perceived to be making important comments applicable to all of the ages to come. This is the permanent relevance of the prophets. I suspect several of you have been to the UN building in New York. Do you remember the statuary that's out in front of the UN building in New York? Remember what the statue is? I've only been there once, but it's been blazoned in my mind. I was there very briefly in 1965, my first time in New York. I went there. It's a statue, a bronze statue, of a man beating a sword into a plowshare.
Beating a sword into a what?
Plowshare.
What is that?
It's the sharp point of a plow.
Oh, a plowshare.
Plowshare.
Okay.
See, you're getting the Kentucky inflection. And let me tell you, young man, I do suspect that I am the only one here in the room. I suspect I'm the only one here that's ever plowed behind a horse. Somebody else?
No.
You did. Well, of course you would. See, Romania and Kentucky, the two places where this is
God's country.
God's country. Maybe, yes, plowshare. I'm probably not saying it right. But notice there's the people who put that up are seeing in Isaiah something that's permanently relevant to what the whole purpose of the United Nations was to do, because the world had been locked in war for several years and millions of people had died. The idea was, let's see if we do something, but this doesn't happen anymore. The origin of the book of Hosea lay in the conviction that what Hosea had to say was relevant to all times and all places. So Hosea represents the transition from prophecy to prophetic literature. If it had not been for two men who took it upon themselves to do so, we would not have a single scrap of the plays of Shakespeare. They were just jotted down, written down on loose paper, put on in the theater, and then just stacked on a shelf someplace. Okay. When Shakespeare died, two men in that acting company got a hold of those plays. And up to that point, Shakespeare had not published anything except his sonnets. In fact, he didn't even publish those. Somebody else got his sonnets and published them without his permission. But we would have lost all of Shakespeare if it hadn't been for two men who decided there's something here everybody needs to know about from this time forth and forevermore. Just think about that. Two guys grabbed these original manuscripts of Shakespeare. Yes, sir.
And weren't even any manuscripts in the sense you're talking about. All the actors got only their parts.
Only got their parts. Yeah.
They didn't get there were no other parts in there.
Thank you for that detail. Yeah. But just think about how close we came to not having Shakespeare. By the way, I recommend a book by Robert B. Young. Is it called Shakespeare and the Concept of Western Civilization, or something like that?
Look it up.
Yeah. Anything you can read by Robert Young is great, but this I think that is going to be his most important book.
Yeah, Shakespeare and the Idea of Western Civilization.
Yeah, Shakespeare and the Idea of Western Civilization. Yeah. Any questions so far? Oh, it looks like the sweet people are already finished. You guys are already out of class? Oh, I better stop then. I will come back to this, continue with this next week. The thing I've just started, I want to make sure everybody gets that. The tension between the immediacy of the prophetic books and the larger audience of the prophetic books. Okay? Glory to the Father, through the Son, in the Holy Spirit, now and ever, the God who is, who was, and is to come at the end of time. Amen. You guys are pretty alert this morning.